To most of the city, the ballroom was gilded and immaculate. To Jacques Teagan, it was a massacre of sound. Footfalls like falling silverware, laughter sharpened into knives, the perfume of 100 strangers pressed into his chest like static. Even from the edge of the marble, behind the cluster of planted ficus, noise made shapes in his bones. It gnawed at the places where his empathy lived, a hunger that could not be sated, and each new tide of feeling left him thinner, rawer, incandescent. He had learned early and with great expense how to move through it. He did not laugh at jokes that stung him, did not offer condolences he did not feel. He parceled his touch into transactions. At 62, CEO, head of a family that wore its history like armor, he had a chance to arrange himself into tolerable shapes. Private wings, soundproof rooms, carefully curated presence. Tonight, though, the city had conspired against him. The charity gala was a blur of bright suits and schmooze, and whatever filtration he used had been overwhelmed. He pressed his palm to his temple and tasted metal. He was already halfway down the service corridor, away from the velvet and the chandeliers, where the acoustics made sound droop into a dull seam. When the world did the improbable thing, it became quiet. Not the tidy hush of a library, not the thin 30 seconds of mourning everyone offered when a chair scraped across tile. It was a silence that dropped like a curtain, heavy and real, as if someone had pressed the city's mouth closed with both hands. The absence of noise itself was a presence, and in that presence a scent rose, damp wool and antiseptic, and the faint sugar of vomit, and under it the warm, stubborn human scent of someone alive but used up. Jacques found the supply closet with the ease of someone who learned to map a building by its shadows. There, in the cramped space between stacks of napkins and floral buckets, a young man lay curled against the gray metal shelving. His hair was dark and matted at the temple. His cheek had a bruise the color of old fruit. He wore a thin jacket that had seen better winters, and sneakers with the laces untied. A paper cup, rimmed with a sticky residue, rolled when Jacques' shoe nudged it, and spattered a film of something sweet onto the linoleum. Jacques crouched because he did not know how to stand without touching the shape of things. When his fingertips found the young man's wrist, the silence deepened as if to satisfy itself. The sensation in him, the hyper-empathy that had been both curse and instrument, poured through him like water finding a drain. All the noise, the tide of other people's wants and discomforts, retreated. For the first time in years, his world was centered not on the roar, but on the raw, contained quiet of another person. There was a reflex he could not classify then, a primitive, protective response. He wrapped his arm under the young man's shoulders, felt the smallness of bone and muscle, the rise and fall of breath, and something inside him throttled. He moved to lift him, and for a fragile second his head cleared. The lobby, the chandeliers, the distant laughter, they were fireworks behind glass. All that existed was the warmth against his ribs and the complete, strange absence of sound. The word for what changed next did not exist in the cleaned corporate lexicon the Teagans used. It was not ownership, though some of his advisors and rivals would later call it that. It was an urgent calculus. This silence was survival. He could not bear to have it hunted away. He called security because he had to. He called for a colleague who could carry a person without causing alarm. He called a car. He did not, in that moment, think of scandals or statements or the impressions such a rescue might make on photographs. He thought of the way the silence settled in his chest like a reserve of water. He thought of the young man's eyelashes, which lemoned with salt and dried blood. By the time the infirmary's fluorescent light washed over the face of the person in his arms, he had learned the other facts. The man could not speak. His throat worked at times like someone learning how to use an instrument again, but sound, coherent, voluntary, did not come. The attending nurse, efficient and untroubled, said, "Suspected ingestion. He's hypoglycemic, dehydrated. Name?" The young man's eyes tracked Jacques with a confounded, raw intelligence, like someone who had been carrying a secret that suddenly had someone to hold it with. When the nurse asked his name, Jacques heard instead a memory in the young man's expression. A flash of someone moving a cup across a dim kitchen, a hand that pushed, a lane of light, and then blankness. "Evan," he said, because a name matters. When the nurse repeated it into the clipboard, the way one repeats orders in a storm, Jacques noticed the bruise on Evan's knuckles and the way his arms cradled, protectively, a rounded, very small belly. Pregnant, the nurse confirmed when she had time to be clinical. There were two. The room tilted. In his chest, the silence shifted like an animal. He had to think through the knot of corporate consequences, paternity questions, public relations, House of Teagan's protocols for scandal-mongering. But the first thing he thought was simply, they were alive. Evan's silence did not simplify things. It complicated them. Ethical, political, human. Jacques could not unsee the bruise on the temple, the smell of congealed coffee, the ragged way Evan flinched when a passerby's foot made a dry tap on the linoleum. He could not pretend the man had not been harmed, and he could not pretend the harm did not make Evan's presence in his life an open wound now pressure-dressed by money and influence.
After the emergency procedures and the legal formalities, there was an inevitable calculus. Threats were not theoretical. Stefan belonged to a network of men who trafficked on silence and on bodies. Leaks could be engineered. The board could, for reasons of pedigree and market perception, decide to disavow a CEO who introduced scandal into the company's public narrative. Rivals could use a pregnancy of ambiguous paternity to unseat a legacy. Jacques' offer, which arrived before he could tell himself it was either compassion or proprietorship, was measured in the only number he trusted: contingency. A marriage would create a legal bond that could redirect gossip, and the resources of the Teagan name could secure Evan from the more brutal consequences of exposure. It would give Evan a roof, doctors on retainer, and a protective line in the sand. Evan's acceptance was not immediate. He considered the contract like someone reading a map in a language they almost knew. There were clauses Jacques insisted upon: security, privacy, guardianship, and clauses Evan added in odd, fierce script that Jacques' lawyers had to parse with patience and an expression of private irritation. Recognition of bodily autonomy, one read. No forced therapy unless requested. Another, no nannies without consent, choice in child naming, full access to all legal documents regarding the twins. Evan's handwriting wavered on the line beside one clause, and then steadied. Right to leave. Jacques watched the way Evan circled the clauses, watched him reclaim himself in small ways. He watched the young man choose the name E.T. for his signature at first, the old nickname that sounded like a joke. Later, he insisted his full name be written in full, with the steady hand that paper demanded. Jacques saw in those script lines a man staking borders. There were conversations, deliberate, measured, that did not fit the world outside. Jacques sat in the study that smelled faintly of lemon oil and old paper and explained carefully what an arranged marriage did in his family's world. It could provide claims, lineage, legal standing. Evan listened with a face that had learned to be stoic and unreadable and at times frightened. He had been a null as long as anyone could remember, biologically resistant to the empathic tide that sweeps through the world. So for Evan, Jacques' empathy was a foreign weather. To Jacques, Evan's nullness had been magnet and mirror. Where others left disharmony, Evan's lack of broadcast quieted Jacques' overstimulated circuits. The attraction was real, but dangerous. Jacques told himself it had to be made safe for everyone, least of all Evan. The wedding was small, not because Jacques wanted to hide it, though some within the company wished he had, but because everyone who attended would be put at risk by more people knowing.
The ceremony was a legal thing, a signing beneath a portrait of the family's founder that, even in its old varnished dignity, looked like an accusation. When Jacques placed a ring on Evan's finger, he felt the slightness of that hand and the weight of his own position. He whispered a promise, not the kind that makes headlines, but the kind that tilts the axis of a life, to defend, to provide, and maybe most dangerously, to listen. Evan signed the contract on the day after the small ceremony. He added a clause he had scribbled the night before with a blunt infant tenderness. "You cannot silence me." Jacques read it 3 times and felt a strange, hot shame. The lawyers called it symbolic. Jacques called it necessary. He found, then and later, that he was capable of shame and of being changed by it. They moved into a wing of the estate where the walls had been lined with tapestry and the windows with double-glazed panes that blocked sound like armor. Evan took to painting in the afternoons, his hands stained with color that had nothing to do with the family's art collection. He painted in blocks, ocean silvers and windscreens, sometimes a portrait of a supply closet light, and when he paused, his palms would go to the place where 2 bodies met against a chest of drawers and become quiet. The city did not leave them alone. Director Smith, with the board's increasing unease, became an instrument of pressure. He leaked a photograph of Jacques at the gala, one where Jacques' face, thoughtful and pinched, suggested a man who cared for nothing but his own comfort. He leaked a grainy clip of Evan, taken through the curtains of the estate, standing on the balcony, a silhouette against a late sun, and commentators spun it into a narrative about puppet masters and heirs. The matriarch, whose voice had been a low bell tolling family verdicts for 40 years, issued a public censure framed as concern. How could the house perpetuate itself if its head was distracted by scandal? Jacques felt the board's pressure like a tightening band around his skull. For the first time, he did not have the immediate option of decisive, unmitigated power. The sound of anger at the edges of the estate, media vans, angry shareholders, rattled at his windows. For all his money and influence, the thing he valued most had become an axis of vulnerability. He had wanted silence for himself. Ownership of other people's silence was a different cruelty. Evan, for his part, developed a private liturgy. He woke early and walked inventory of their small household, the pantry, the medicine cabinet, the old typewriter Jacques kept for drafting letters in longhand. He attended sessions with a counselor who specialized in trauma and nonverbal recovery. At first, the sessions were exercises in trust. He would sit in a room and be asked to breathe, to list objects in his mind, to imagine rooms that were safe.
Sometimes the counselor put a word to his face, and he would twitch the muscles of his mouth in a way that suggested speech was a heavy thing, weighted with the memory of being used. Small gestures mattered. Jacques began to understand the language of Evan's silence, the way he chewed bread at a table and did not look up, the way his hand smoothed a sleeve when he was thinking, the way he tapped the paintbrush between two fingers when he was composing an image. Jacques listened. He learned to ask for consent in small ways that were legal and humane. "May I sit beside you? Can I carry a bag upstairs?" Evan answered by the simplest of things: nods, hands pressed flat, a single raised eyebrow in an infallible negation. These were not the confession of return to intimacy, but the scaffolding of permission. Outside their walls, the narrative fractured into lines. Some editors took to sentimental pity. Rich man rescues sleeping waif. Others cried scandal. A CEO uses his position to hide predatory acts. A tabloid headline asked a sensational question about the paternity of the twins and whether corporate succession might be affected. Jacques began to receive letters with clipped threats and lawsuits drafted in legalese. Friends offered counsel that smelled like fear. The matriarch called him into the portrait room one evening, where faces looked down like jurors, and asked him bluntly whether he had thought of legacy. Jacques said, quiet and unguarded, that he had thought of the children first. The matriarch's eyes were stone. Then came Dr. Vrenden's report, which arrived on a slate-gray morning. The doctor's handwriting was precise and unadorned. The diagnosis was not. "There are neurological linkages between the twins," the report informed them, clinical as a ledger. "They show a pattern of neurophysiological synchronization not commonly observed." The explanation, boiled into a corporate acceptable paragraph, suggested that the twins' neural rhythms responded to each other in ways that could, under duress, generate an effect akin to a null field when synchronized, an amplified quiet that could shield in immediate radius. The implications spelled wonder and fear, and in offices and in boardrooms the word traveled like a contagious, perfect rumor. The board was split. A faction wanted to study the twins under the auspices of the company, to commodify their physiology for profit and control. Director Smith's voice carried the argument that science could make the estate's name into a legacy of innovation. The matriarch's allies argued for sequestering the children from public view until the risk was known, fearing anything unpredictable attached to inheritance. The faction that supported Jacques argued the opposite. The world needed to see a family that protected difference and that embraced new kinds of kinship.
When Jacques signed a directive that guaranteed Evan sole parental authority over the twins' health decisions, the sound in the Teagan boardroom was like a blade sliding from its sheath. Not because it was rebellious, Jacques had long abused authority, but because it asked the family to put the welfare of two unborn people above their own image. Board members chewed phrases like fiduciary duty and market stability and tried to speak them over Jacques' insistence on compassion. He, for his part, felt every heartbeat in the room as if a metronome had been pressed to his sternum. Evan attended one board dinner, the Give and Take, an annual event where alliances were forged with the same care people used to forge swords. He arrived in a sound-muffled carriage, and for the first hour he sat at the edge of the room like a painting with a breathing subject. He was pregnant, his belly rounded in a way that made the matriarch's expression colder. The cameras loved the visual, and the pundits supplied the narrative. The night did not explode immediately. Instead, a slow coagulation happened. Someone at a table began to talk loudly about legacy, and someone else whispered the question of legitimacy. A member of the board, Cousin Mark, made a joke that landed like a stone into a still pond. Their laughter sounded small, brittle. Director Smith circulated a rumor of a pre-existing marriage certificate, unsigned files that had been stamped in some hidden registry a decade prior, a procedural thing, he said, that would complicate Jacques' current legal standing. Jacques felt the pull of blood memory, genealogical lists, marriage contracts, a family's ancient obsession with lines. He did not move to confront the whisperers. He had other tasks, but the suggestion lodged, invasive and keen. Evan watched the room in the way someone with the true null could watch. He paid attention to shifts, to the way air itself changed at the edge of words. He put his hand on his belly and did not speak. The leak grew like mold. Overnight, a lawyer at a small record office in a suburb called to say there was an administrative marriage certificate filed under Jacques Teagan's name, dated, photocopied, stamped. A woman's name curled in an old-fashioned script across the top of the page. Jacques knew the name and had never seen it in years. It was a legal technicality from a youthful political alliance he had long thought dissolved, a marriage never publicly acknowledged in an effort to govern an old scandal. It had been a marriage in name only, a legal buffer used once upon a time to save appearances. He had thought the paper buried. The existence of that certificate would permit someone, anyone with a heart for litigation and a camera, to call him to account. It would create a narrative where he had two valid spouses, one public, one private. It would hand the matriarch and her minions a lever. It could overturn everything they had fought to assemble.
Evan learned of it the way Evan learned most things, by watching the weather in Jacques' face. For once, Jacques did not try to hide the agitation. He paced, and the estate listened. He felt exposed in a new way, not by his enemies, but by the social machinery he once commanded. The silence he craved was now a commodity with a price tag. To preserve it, he had bargained into a legal bond. To keep Evan protected, he had chained himself to an old paper that might return to haunt him. At night, when the city melted into distant, unwanted sound, Evan would sit in the studio and paint images of two bodies in a field, not touching but connected by a thin thread. In the way he mixed color, you could see the future he wanted. Small, bright things, safe from opportunists. He painted the twins as if they were already there, one a small fist of red, the other a slender blue line of thinking, their heads joined by a luminous bridge. Jacques, in those hours, read the old certificate like a foreign text. The woman's name on the paper had been married to his name for a purpose he had once accepted without protest. He had assumed the file had been expunged in favor of more modern legal arrangements, but bureaucracies keep ghosts. Someone had pulled the ghost into light. The night before the board was to convene an emergency session, one that would discuss both Jacques' fitness for office and the guardianship of the unborn. Evan walked to the estate's lowest garden and sat where the oxygen felt right. He had been given advice to prepare a statement, a declaration of independence, an assertion of parental rights, a refusal of invasive study. He had been offered a publicist to shape his image into a narrative the world would accept. He refused the publicist. Instead, he picked up a paintbrush and began to draw on the smooth stone bench with wet pigment he kept in a small pot. His lines were crude by anyone outside his quiet would judge them, but they were exact to him. While the city, like a beast, warmed itself for the hunt, Evan made a map of what he loved. It was not a vow to Jacques. It was not an ownership mark. It was a delineation of a life he intended to keep. And somewhere beneath these hushed preparations, the old marriage certificate cast a long shadow. It waited in the file folders of an attorney who owed a debt, on the desk of a rival who wanted a seat, and in the inbox of a woman whose life had been shaped by the same political mechanics that once bound Jacques to her. The legal machinery of the world had teeth and means, and it would not be long before those teeth found the fabric of their fragile household. If your curiosity is new to this work, or if you prefer long-form chapters delivered to your feed, subscribe now. This story unfolds in careful parts. The following morning, Jacques convened the board. He walked into the room like a man who had nothing left to hide and everything to lose.
The portrait of the family founder watched from its gilded frame as suits arranged themselves around the table in a predatory geometry. Director Smith arrived with clipped steps. Cousin Mark, a smile sharpened into a brandished argument. The matriarch sat at the head of the table with the kind of patience that reads like a sentence served slowly. There were talkings, legal strategies, public relations countermeasures, quiet threats about ceding control. Jacques listened and found his patience thinning. When the matriarch asked about the cost, the intangible and the fiscal, Jacques surprised them by asking one of his own, "What is the cost of silence?" "We have a lot riding on perception," Director Smith said. His voice had the brittle flattery of a man used to winning votes. "What about people?" Jacques replied. His voice was low, but the room became, for one exquisite moment, notably louder to him. He had not intended to speak with such heat. The hyper-empathy made few gestures kind when moved to go to battle. "We have children." Someone in the corner murmured that the twins' physiology could be an asset if managed. Another suggested that if the twins could project a no field when linked, that knowledge should belong to the household and by extension to the corporation as an intellectual property claim. Jacques' response did not involve corporate speak. He spoke with a bluntness that made people shift in their chairs. "You treat them like patents. You speak of them like resources. They are human. They are not devices we test for profit." A ripple of discomfort passed through the room. The matriarch's hands tightened on her napkin. It had not been his usual skill to confront the board's cold calculus. He felt the burn of his own name, Teagan, the history it carried, the expectations it layered onto his decisions. Outside, in the parking lot, a delivery van that should have been harmless idled too long. There were figures at the curb with cameras. A file with a longer legal tail had found its way into a reporter's inbox. The scent of impending public spectacle hummed like a mosquito. Evan, who spent his mornings stringing together the small rituals that made the day bearable, gathered a palette and a cloth. He did not know legalese, and he did not have a boardroom voice. He had the bones of a quiet life and the first recognitions that paper could save or slaughter. He had learned in therapy that names were worth protecting. He seemed, to those who knew him best now, to understand the situation with the most candid clarity. When the world was controverted, it would not negotiate with kindness. It would use the formalities as weapons. Jacques returned from the meeting with a resolution to defend their rights, personally, legally, publicly. He found Evan in the studio, a smudge of ultramarine on his thumb, the sunlight through the windows painting his profile a quiet gold.
Jacques sat and watched him paint, feeling an unfamiliar tenderness that had nothing to do with market share. He wanted, suddenly and with absolute clarity, to be better. When Jacques reached for Evan's hand, his touch caught, not with the old need to control, but with a new humility. Evan did not pull away. He let Jacques stay until dusk, and then, with a small, decisive gesture, Jacques left to prepare lawyers and press statements. The two of them had not declared love as a public commodity. They had aligned with a shared aim, protection. They had, in the hush between them, a strategy. Weeks passed in a quiet, tense choreography. The legal team scoured records, security assessed risks. Publicist speak was written and withheld. The matriarch sent messages that were both supportive and icy. Director Smith prepared a dossier that smelled of betrayal. In the evenings, when the house settled into that lovely small sound it made, when all the world outside was making other worlds, Evan painted faces that had never existed, and Jacques read articles that intended to make them disappear. Then the envelope came, a thick brown thing with a stamp and a wrong address. Inside, pressed between the old paper, was a photocopy of a marriage certificate from another life. The woman's name was there in an old-fashioned hand that seemed to know every diplomatic wrong a household could ever suffer. It was an administrative document, dated, stamped. It proved nothing more than a name on a file. Yet it contained enough which, if staffed by the right voices in the right moment, could become a lever. Jacques considered destroying it. He also considered the history that paper represented, a younger man's agreement for expediency, a name tacked to his life like a historical footnote. He called the lawyer who had been with him longest, the one whose voice made even the matriarch defer, and he asked a question slow as a confession. "If she comes," Jacques said, "how do we defend ourselves without making this a spectacle? You either make it true that she is merely a technicality, or you make the case that your marriage to Mr. Et is a matter of family security and parental protective duty. Either way, you must act before someone else interprets the document for you." Jacques listened and felt the old quiet like a tide returning. For the first time since he had found Evan in the supply closet, he felt the thing he had craved return with a cost attached. He had invited silence into his life and had thought it a cure for the way the world pulled at him. Now silence had legal footprints and human bodies, and the cost of defending that quiet would be raw and public. Evan, painting in the studio, listened to coffee boil in the kitchen and the faint sound of pages turning. He did not want to be a shield. He did not want to be an instrument. He wanted, in his simple, resilient way, to make a life where the twins could be themselves.
He dipped his brush into a green that was not quite safe and thought about naming. Names were maps. Names were declarations. He painted two small abstract shapes holding hands. The first part of the conflict had been the finding, the rescue, the papers signed under the peculiar twilight of necessity. The second part, which unspooled like a cautious beast, was about what the world would do now that it knew there were children at stake and that a document existed in the attic of a courthouse somewhere with a woman's name waiting to take up a claim. On the morning the board scheduled the emergency vote, a courier came with a notice. The woman associated with the old certificate, publicly the legal wife, had retained counsel. She had not, until that sealed envelope, been in the story. Now she was a needle ready to puncture the veil. Jacques folded the notice with fingers that were not steady. He felt the silence inside him hollow, and then fill with something like resolve. He had taken a man into his house because he needed to breathe. He had signed a contract because he had ethical obligations, and human ones he could no longer deny. Now the world would take its turn in the public square. Whatever came next, he would have to choose, aloud, for the children, and for the man who had offered him a quiet no one else could give. Evan heard, in the sudden shift of light through the studio windows, the movement that meant the day would not be ordinary. He stood, wiped his hands on his jeans, and walked to the study where the papers were kept. He did not speak. The habit of years had not been overturned, yet when he placed his hand over Jacques', the CEO felt something like an answer that would not be forced. Outside the estate, the city adjusted its lenses. Reporters ordered breakfast. Board members arranged their faces. a woman who had lived at the margins of Jacques' past, prepared to make herself central. The next voices would be large and public and carrying, like a storm, the potential to sweep them away. Inside the quiet house, where the old tapestries absorbed sound like old grief, two people sat with the knowledge that their private pact would soon be litigated in the court of public opinion. They knew that silence had cost them safety, and now would be defended with arguments and words that would make noise of them all. A car pulled up at the gate at dusk, its engine quiet but definite. The courier's footsteps on the gravel were small, and the envelope that was handed across a polished palm had the authority of inevitability. Jacques took it like a soldier taking a summons. Evan went to the window and looked out at the path the courier had taken. He stared at the dusk like it might tell him something. He had learned, in his quiet life, to brace for the sound. When it came, it would not be in decibels, but in the kind of public pressure that could pry the house's doors open.
He had painted shields for his children in pigment that dried on his fingers, and he had scavenged a list of legal phrases he would never use in everyday talk. When Jacques opened the envelope and read the letter, his jaw tightened. The legal wife, her name on the paper, planned to present herself at the estate in 3 days. She would arrive in a public carriage, surrounded by counsel and possibly cameras. The board had been notified. Director Smith, with his taste for strategic spectacle, had already suggested turning the face-off into a press-managed event. It would be framed as a matter of inheritance and legitimacy, he said, without shame. Jacques looked up and saw Evan watching him. No words were needed. The quiet between them was not an absence of sound, but a compact of choice. They had, together, set a line. Now someone had found the other side of that line and had a claim to step over it. It would not be the supply closet that defined them anymore. It would be the public threshold and the faces that looked in. The house, which once had rooms where silence could be purchased, now had to hold a truth that could not be bought, the right to choose, to protect, to parent. Outside, the city practiced its roar. Inside, for the briefest night, there was only the soft scraping of a paintbrush and the faint, unreadable rhythm of two hearts deciding to stand against whatever would come. The carriage wheels sounded like a small rumor against the gravel, and for a moment Jacques watched the motion with the same delicacy he used to listen for the faintest tremor in a boardroom argument. Everything about the approach to Teagan Manor had been rehearsed in his head a dozen times. Routes, press containment, the legal counsel's phrasing. He had written notes and then discarded them because notes felt like compromises. Outside, the world began to assemble its opinion. Inside, the house braced. He met the woman in the front hall, beneath a chandelier that caught her hair in little fires. Her coat was coal black, cut to the silhouette of someone used to adhering to a public contour. She was not old enough to be a matriarch, not young enough to be naive. Her name, he had read it 100 times on a Xeroxed page, was Lillian Marchand. Up close, Lillian had an architecture of composure, the way the matriarch had a way of holding coin. There was always a calculation beneath the expression. She inclined her head with civility the press would call measured. Her counsel stood behind her with a leather briefcase and an air of things that had been planned. "You look," Jacques began, because politeness still mattered, and because there was absurdly an inherited etiquette to this. His hand went to his coat, instinct still asking for a physicality to the conversation. Lillian smiled with a mouth that did not reach her eyes. "Older," she said, before the thought could be framed as a question. Her tone was not unkind. It was correct.
You slept well, Mr. Teagan? Jacques heard the house inhale, and for the briefest moment the ceiling seemed to lean in. He had expected a demand for money, for station, perhaps a threat of blackmail. He had not expected the steadiness of someone who had been used to waiting. "Why have you returned?" he asked. He kept his empathy under a practiced leash. The room around them hummed with other people's expectations, and he could taste them: entitlement, glee, curiosity. He wanted to hold the silence around his chest like a shield. Lillian's eyes moved to the corridor where Evan's studio and the private papers were kept, and then away. "Because I was told there is an heir," she said. The word left a little shock in the hallway like a dropped coin. "Because I know there is an administrative record attesting a union. Because I was never kept apprised of what was supposed to be a practical arrangement. And because I have a right to ask for what was promised." There was a small private history in that sentence. Years ago, Jacques had sealed a name to his for reasons of dynasty and diplomacy. Lillian had accepted the terms as any woman in her position might, a bargain that would preserve some political seam, a role that would secure a livelihood. Those terms looked different then, when money and alliances were the currency, and privacy could be purchased cheaply. She had been a figurehead, an inventory item in the Teagan ledger. The agreement had been administrative, a buffer against scandal. In the end, it had been paper stacked against life. She had not been a simple instrument. She had been, at first, a woman with expectations. She had built a life around them, and then found it quietly repurposed. The children she might have had were not born, and what remained was a name in the registry. That was the wound beneath her calm. She wanted something more than the records, Jacques understood now, something like recognition for the half-history she had been asked to play. And she wanted to be a problem solved for those who would use her. She had, in the years since the administrative marriage, been both leveraged and abandoned. That complexity, wounded dignity, and strategic self-preservation was what came with Lillian when she walked into the house like a calm wave. The matriarch awaited them in the dining room, her expression mapped to the width of a legal brief. Director Smith hovered as well, small and efficient as a wasp. Cousin Mark lingered in the doorway with a relish that did not help. Lillian's counsel spoke first, the kind of precise articulation that transforms motives into bullets. "Mrs. Marchand requests recognition. She intends to pursue her legal rights in respect to the union recorded in the public registry dated 12 years past." The matriarch's lips thinned. "You intend to present yourself here uninvited and demand what?" she asked, with a tone that implied jurisprudence could be replaced with scorn. "You intend to be seen," Lillian said, and there was no tremor in it. "I intend to be recognized for an administrative truth that has been used like a curtain while my name gathered dust." Jacques watched them like a predicate. His worry was not of the paper so much as of the performance that would turn their private life into a spectacle. He had already imagined cameras in the garden and vultures at the gate. He had also imagined worst-case legal scenarios, injunctions, contested guardianship, reputational hemorrhage. None of that mattered as much as the presence of a pregnant man who could not speak and the 2 children inside him who had no voice yet. Evan stood in the doorway of the studio when Lillian was announced. He had been painting. The air around his shoulders still held the smell of pigment and linseed oil. He did not move to greet or to retreat. He had learned the ways the house's interior reacted to new presences. He placed a hand lightly on his belly and watched Lillian's entrance as if he were memorizing a face for later. Lillian's eyes found him with an accuracy that surprised Jacques. She stepped forward as if she were measuring a room by its load-bearing walls, and then she stopped. Instead of a flourish, she offered a document folded with careful, almost ritualistic fingers. "This certificate," she said, and held it out as if offering a coin, "entitles me to certain rights until such time as it can be shown to be void. I am prepared to pursue them." She turned and fixed the look of the assembled board, Director Smith, Cousin Mark, the matriarch, like a judge reading the beginning of a case. Director Smith smiled too readily. "We can address this in private," he said. "There are ways to resolve bureaucratic anomalies. We will—" "No," Lillian interrupted, and the single word carried over the polished table and fell like a pebble into a pond. That was the needle. It set camera shutters blinking on the periphery of Jacques' mind. The board could not accept a public fight that painted them as manipulators. The matriarch, whose face had been carved from reserve and calculation, felt the first tremor of panic. She did not like noise that could not be charted. Evan, who stood like a simple, defiant shape, felt, perhaps more than anyone, the immediate change in the atmosphere. The room's edges scraped and murmured. Voices rose and fell like sea. He could feel, without the heat of projection, the coercive calculations of counsel, the purring hunger of pressed desire. His body, accustomed to holding silence like a coin, reacted.
When a dinner guest, an older cousin whose voice had always been whittled with brittle wit, made a comment about convenient marriages, the sound ricocheted like a thrown glass. Lillian's face did not shatter, it hardened. "You speak like a man who never had to pay for a name," she said, measured and cold. "My life has not been an appendage." The matriarch's hand tightened on a napkin. Jacques felt his own pulse thicken under the question of names. He had the capacity to rip this room into pieces with a single legal edict. He also had the obligation to do it without making the life of the pregnant man worse. "Mr. Teagan," Lillian continued, and she turned to Jacques now, "you have responsibilities beyond the ledger. If you claim children within your household, you must show how you will account for the contractual obligations that were put in place when you accepted this administrative marriage." There was a neatness to the accusation. It suggested bureaucracy as morality. You adhered to the forms, and forms governed action. It also, cleverly, put the matriarch and the board on the defensive. If Jacques were shown to have kept an old marriage unfinished, someone could challenge his current actions as legally improper. It was a weapon shaped like paper. Director Smith, who had spent weeks preparing for exactly this sort of manipulation, had a ready smile that did not reach his eyes. "This is unfortunate timing," he said. "We will cooperate with any inquiries, but we must also consider the welfare of the unborn. Public spectacle will only harm the children." Lillian's counsel clicked his pen. "My client does not seek spectacle. She seeks her name to be legal validation of what she was promised. If Mr. Teagan wishes to refute this, we will follow the law." In the press room down the lane, cameras had already been planted. Online feeds were warming like an engine. Someone had called a reporter with the Xeroxed picture of the certificate and a rumor attached. A lady who had been an administrative spouse intended to present herself. The story would not sleep. Jacques felt something in him that was not the old hunger for silence, but a strictness with which he would defend the household from legal canons. He moved now with different muscles, not the acquisitive arms of a man used to taking what he wanted, but the defensive hands of a father who had learned to ask permission. He had learned, painfully, that consent had to be explicitly offered and accepted. He had not expected the legal wife to be anything other than a problem,
and yet Lillian's presence made him feel raw in the tenderest of ways, vulnerable to accusation, to scandal, to the hard work of making things right. He rose and walked to the small lectern they had set by the piano for precisely such small public utterances, and he spoke with the bluntness of someone who had been through a boardroom and an emergency room and had found both wanting in human touch.
"There will be no trial by rumor here," he said. "Miss Marchand has presented an administrative record. We will cooperate fully, but I will not have either my household or these children used as leverage in any corporate quarrel. They are human beings." Lillian's face did not betray much. She had come for recognition, and perhaps to be seen as someone wronged. The matriarch's eyes were knives. Director Smith felt the tide shift, and in that instant withdrew a card on which he had prepared an alternate narrative, Lillian as instrument, Lillian as pawn. Then Lillian did a curious thing. She dropped her public posture for a heartbeat and looked directly at Jacques. In that glance was a small, honest truth. She had once been asked to be a name on a line, and she had been willing. But she had never been asked if she wanted to continue being that thing when the cost became real. "I am not here to take anyone's children," she said softly. "I am here to be counted as a person who was used and then closed away." Her words reframed the spectacle. If this were about a woman claiming rights to a heritage, the shape of the news would be one thing. If this were about a woman saying she had been kept in silence while others made decisions for her, the narrative belonged to Lillian and not to a corporation. It was then that the first camera down the lane caught Evan's reaction. He did not speak, of course. He had not been able to yet, but his body moved like a conductor setting a downbeat. The sound in the house bent, as if someone had taken a sheet and stretched it taut across the corridor. The clink of silver, the whisper of cloth, the breath of people. The silence fell, and it was not empty. It was like setting a stage. People noticed it the way one notices a light change before seeing an image. Conversations thinned, forks stopped halfway to mouths. Even Director Smith's smile faltered. It was a silence Evan created without gesturing, like the quiet of a room where everyone is waiting for news. Jacques felt it as an answering bell. In that silence, Lillian's voice seemed to crack. She had expected fury, legal sparring, or the sympathy of the press. She had not expected to be met with, what? A calm that did not belong to her, that did not bend to the pressures she had come to wield. Her counsel cleared his throat and fetched a handkerchief as if for a wound. The matriarch's face crumpled into a thin private rage that had nowhere to land. People will always try to fill a silence, Jacques thought. They exaggerate the pause into accusation. He watched faces around him as if they were pages, and he, for once, wanted to write with a different pen. He noticed with a new humility that Evan's nullness was not only an absence of noise, but an absence of the need to be seen in a market of opinions. For Jacques, used to prowling emotional currents, it was a revelation. Lillian's counsel cleared his throat. "Miss Marchand will proceed with her claim," he said. The legal phrase was a rope thrown across the room. "But let it be known Ms. Marchand has not announced any desire to obstruct Mr. Teagan's parental responsibilities." Lillian herself remained quiet for a moment. When she finally spoke, her voice was both gentler and sharper than before. "I want my name to mean something beyond a box on a page. If this house wishes to keep its story private, I will not stand in the way. But be honest with me. Was I ever anything to you beyond a convenience?" Jacques felt the question like an incision. He had a long list of cowardice to confess, and had not yet come to the place to do it. He took a breath,
which felt absurdly like a legal deposition. "You were always something," he said, "and I will ensure the world understands that none of the children here will be treated as leverage." Whether it was because of Lillian's candor, because of Evan's quiet composure, or because of some shifting public sentiment, the story that leaked out that evening did not go the way Director Smith had intended. The press, which greedily longed for salacious sin, paused at the more human note, a woman who had been political fodder and a silent man about to bear heirs. The image of them in the same hallway forced a complexity the tabloids could not flatten quickly. For the board, the moment was both a dodge and a blow. That night, after the visitors had left and the cameras had gone, Lillian sat alone on the terrace with a cup of tea that had gone cold and watched the city like a landscape. Evan, who had retreated to the studio, painted with a hand that seemed steadier than before. Jacques stood at the study window and listened to the city's distant engines. The quiet had not solved anything, it had simply made the problem clearer. Director Smith, predictably, was not finished. He moved to refocus the narrative around legal technicalities and the twins' biology, whispering that the board must consider the implications of the children's neurophysiology on the company's future. He circulated a memo that smelled of profit and fear. He argued for a controlled review and a scientific partnership under the company's aegis. The matriarch, ever loyal to legacy, favored withdrawal and protective sequestration. Jacques refused both ideas. He instructed counsel to prepare for a public audit if need be and to file declarations that prioritized Evan's parental authority. He did not relish the fight. He simply understood now that some battles must be chosen because they were morally necessary. He had come to this conclusion not from high-mindedness, but because the idea of his children being parceled out to committees made him want to retch. "Do not let them make you cruel to get to a kind outcome," Evan wrote once on a slip of paper and handed it to him in the privacy of the study. Jacques folded it like a precious thing and placed it in his pocket. The paper gave him a clarity that law could not. The board called for a vote to appoint interim guardianship committees and to place the twins' future under a provisional oversight until birth. Jacques refused the motion with such bluntness that some members of the board thought him reckless. In the quiet aftermath, someone leaked a series of emails, mostly drafts, from Director Smith suggesting ways to weaponize Lillian's return in order to discredit Jacques. The leak did more than expose an agenda. It indicated that there were factions within the board, tired of Smith's methods. Assistant Brooks, sweating and loyal, had left a folder in the wrong printer, and the press had found it. The little human act of error reshaped the fight. Lillian watched the exposure unfold, and in a moment that showed why she had once been chosen for diplomacy, she made a decision. She could have leaned into the role the board offered her, maestro of scandal, queen of a public argument, and used the certificate to demand money and amusement. Instead, she did something that surprised them all. She issued a short statement, not of accusation, but of exoneration toward the household. "I was once a convenience, and I refuse to be used again. If the board or any institution attempted to make me an instrument, I will not comply. These children deserve maybe the simplest thing, the right to be raised without being made the subject of a corporate experiment." The statement landed like a quiet grenade. The press reeled, the board scowled. Director Smith looked as if someone had removed the rug from under his plan. Whether out of embarrassment or true conscience, Lillian chose to step away from the lawsuit she might have pursued. She negotiated, cleanly and with a steel that mirrored Jacques' own, an agreement. A renunciation of marital claims in exchange for a public accounting of the administrative marriage's history, a financial settlement that would allow her independence, and a condition that the Teagan household would assist in creating an independent foundation for women who had been used in political marriages. For Lillian, the bargain was not a surrender, but a reclamation. She left the estate months later, with a modest office in the city and a future that was not dependent on a name. She did not forgive everything, and she did not pretend the past was not a wound. She did, however, choose autonomy over spectacle. It was enough to loosen Director Smith's leash. It was not enough to absolve the board of its conscience, but it was enough to make the public see the fight for what it had been, not a simple contest of heirs, but a tangle of broken arrangements that required repair. Even as these corporate currents shifted, the real life of the household moved on in more elemental ways. The twins' presence in the world was no longer only a theoretical problem for the board to solve.
They were a presence itching into the margins of now, felt on shoulders, in breaths, in the way the house prepared for the arrival of two small bodies. There were medical negotiations, of course. Dr. Vrendon arranged consultations and proposed monitoring regimes. He spoke carefully of risk management, of protocols that could be put in place should the twins show synchronous neural patterns of interest to science. Jacques, having been schooled in the ways of public liability, asked the obvious questions about consent and exploitation. Evan, ever the quiet, stubborn custodian of his and the twins' right to choose, rejected invasive studies proposed in the name of corporate oversight. The discussions were long and filled with the legal language of guardianship and medical ethics. "Will you allow them to be scanned?" Dr. Vrendon asked once, the clinical uniform of duty making his tone unadorned. Evan looked at him with the plainness of someone used to making a scarce vocabulary work. He put both hands on his belly and said nothing. In that quietness he answered with a clarity far beyond the words they traded. No, they would not be specimens. Jacques, to his own unknown surprise, supported that refusal. "We will have independent oversight," he told Dr. Vrendon, "not for the sake of secrecy, but for the sake of their dignity. No corporate ownership." The doctor nodded with a curiosity that read like a ledger of new rules and small moral victories. There were lawsuits that never materialized, public relations that were stymied, but most importantly, there were choices made together, two people deciding how two unborn lives would be treated. Those choices mattered more than any board vote. Labor began on a night when the city was rainy and the estate smelled of wet stone. The alert came like a small combustion. Evan doubled over in the studio, and the household felt the tremor. Nurses who had been pre-positioned arrived with the kind of quiet professionalism that makes trauma manageable. Jacques, who had only recently learned to be present in ways that did not involve domination, folded himself into the role of support with an honesty that rendered him vulnerable. "You may have to ask for everything," Jacques said quietly, during a lull between contracted breaths, "and I will wait. Tell me what you want." Evan squeezed his hand twice. That was the consent that mattered. Two small squeezes that told Jacques' permission and led him into the task of being present rather than seizing. He stood by, working the small comforts Evan had mapped earlier: cool cloths, the right music, a string quartet Evan had requested, and a presence that asked permission before touch. The birth room smelled of citrus and clinical iron. It sounded like breath and a muted thunder.
If the city had raged like a beast beyond, inside there was a Foster's hush with sharp interruptions. Jacques felt a trepidation he had not known before, a fear that this thing might rupture the pattern he had set for himself, quiet as a commodity, bought and sold. He had been taught to keep his face still for shareholders. Here his face moved and broke sometimes into a look of unfiltered wonder. The first child arrived with a sound that was almost rebellious. Mason, a burst of low, urgent cry that was alpha strong in its insistence on space and presence. The nurses cooed with a mix of professional detachment and human relief. He was robust, red, a small fist of demand. He labored like someone who would make his presence known. The second child, Lucia, arrived with an altogether different music. She was quiet at first, as if to need the room. Then, as if to answer a question no one in the world thought to ask, Lucia made a sound that was not quite a voice and not quite a thought. People in the room, even the hardened nurses, felt their faces unclench as something like understanding moved across them. Jacques, who had been holding Evan's hand as if the hand were a bridge, felt for a single breath something like a stream of images slide through him. A paint-smeared studio, a supply closet with a napkin stuck to the floor, a stairwell where quiet had been found like a small animal. The images were not his own, but they carried the texture of a memory so intimate he could not own it. When he opened his eyes, Evan was crying, actual unbolted tears, because he had felt in the sliver of a newborn's first projection a kind of confirmation that what they had done mattered. Lucia's presence, delicate and strong, cast a small null field the way a pebble creates rings. It was not invasive, it was the definition of recognition. People called it miraculous, and science called it interesting, and the matriarch called it unsettling. For Jacques, exhausted and raw, it was simply true, and blessing enough. The aftermath was a blur of legal forms and a nauseous press swirl. Cameras waited like flies outside the hospital doors. The board, which had been plotting for advantage, found itself astonished by a public that, at least for a while, wanted to watch a family be born rather than watch a game of title claims. There were op-eds and television panels and delicate social currents that pulled one way and then another, but the central fact remained. 2 children existed, and the household had chosen to protect them. Director Smith, whose career had been constructed on quiet manipulations, had overreached in a way that revealed him to be greedy and small. Assistant Brooks, who had once been thin and nervous and had learned to be quietly loyal, had left a trail of breadcrumbs, old messages, drafts, obvious patterns, and when the press followed them, it did not make for triumph so much as confession. The board was forced to reckon with allies who had grown tired of its methods.
The matriarch, who had sought to preserve the house's image at the expense of everything else, found that her influence had cracks. She chose to retreat rather than be a public spectacle of doctrinal hardness. As for Lillian, she watched these ripples and then set about something new. Her foundation grew out of the agreement she had brokered with Jacques, a place that would help women and men who had been used in strategic unions to find support. It would be in her hands a way to make up for time and to reclaim voice. It also provided her with an identity beyond the shadow of an administrative paper. It was, quietly, the most impressive victory of the whole episode. There were small domestic scenes that followed the big public ones, and they mattered as much as any corporate reorganization. Evan painted late into the evening, interspersing images of 2 small figures connected by a thread. Jacques learned to leave the boardroom behind and to knock gently on the studio door rather than barge through it. He learned one night especially to ask, "May I sit with you?"
and to wait for both the nod of yes and for the pressure of consent that made a world possible. They did not fall into a neat romance. There were nights when the old power in Jacques' bones rose and he had to check himself and ask for counsel. There were sessions with therapists and apologies that did not pretend to be heroic. There were, too, small and fierce declarations of equality from Evan, rules that Jacques signed to show he meant them, not because the signatures were legally necessary, but because they were morally so. No decisions for the children without both parents present, read one clause. No interrogation by corporate scientists without full consent and independent counsel, read another, in Evan's careful handwriting. When the press eventually retreated, sated and with little left to glean but human smallness and nuance, the story shifted. People began to talk about the twins not as assets, but as children. There were still pundits and still those who wanted a scandal, but the public appetite shifted toward the image of a family managing an extraordinary existence with dignity. Years later, because the life of families is measured in small increments, not press cycles, Mason was a riot of a boy, enviably loud and literal, the kind of child who would bang on doors to be noticed and learned early to protect his sister. Lucia was an observant girl, her eyes mapping the room like a cartographer, capable of projecting feelings so clearly that adults found themselves soothed or startled by the precision of her empathy. The Teagan estate, once a closed grammar of power, reshaped into something like a home. Jacques had not become a gentler man by decree. He had been softened by the work of honest contrition and daily acts of listening. He presided over his company with a steadier hand, more willing to be questioned and to let some things go.
He had found the strange luck of losing a certain kind of absolute control and gaining, instead, a kind of moral clarity that made him less isolated and more present. Evan established a modest gallery in the city. His paintings, lucid, raw, and insistently human, drew crowds of those who wanted to see someone who had been silent make noise in color and stroke. He taught art to children, including children with unusual neurology, and he advocated for medical ethics reforms that protected families from exploitation. He sometimes painted late at night and would find Jacques asleep on the couch, a book fallen from his hands. Evan would smile, not because life had solved every problem, but because the household had become a place where they could be honest about their needs and choose to meet them together. Lillian's foundation thrived. She never sought a reconciliation with Jacques that resembled marriage. Instead, she sought and achieved something quieter, a life whose axis was not a name attached to another person, but the work she chose. She and Jacques spoke sometimes, exchanging formal notes and occasionally a cordial dinner. The matriarch, chastened and private, lived out her remaining years with a grudging respect for a family that had refused to be defined by ghostly papers. People told the story as a drama of heirs and scandal, and then were surprised to find it, at its heart, was a story of deliberate repair. The city adjusted its expectations slowly. Where once the Teagan name had suggested an unassailable fortress, it came to suggest a complicated, if not always pretty, family willing to bear witness to their own failures and to choose again and again to do better. On a small winter afternoon, when Mason chased a dog through the garden and Lucia sat on the stoop tracing constellations into frost, Jacques and Evan stood side by side near the studio window and watched the two of them. The house was a little quieter these days, not because silence had been purchased, but because it had been earned. "You taught me to ask," Jacques said then, his voice rumbling like a memory. Evan laid his paint-stained fingers over Jacques and squeezed. He did not speak. He did not need to. The small pressure meant yes, and everything that followed it. Jacques leaned his forehead against Evan's temple, a small and private gesture, and allowed himself the fragile understanding that had eluded him for decades, that silence could be a gift when freely given, that noise could be welcomed when it was chosen, and that the truest inheritance he could leave was not a company or a line of paper, but 2 children who would know they were not for sale. If you have followed them this far and want to stay with the family as they continue to grow and to navigate the world, subscribe for the next chapter and the quieter afternoons where the small things change everything.